Do Donald Trump's strikes in Nigeria serve any purpose? The US president says they're against ISIL, claiming that it targets Christians in the country. But are his allegations of religious persecution in Nigeria justified? And could his administration have other motives? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Adrian Finighan. More to come. Those are the words of the US War Secretary after his country carried out a wave of airstrikes against the Islamic State in northwestern Nigeria. Pete Hegseth said that the aim is to stop the killing of what he called innocent Christians. Back in November, President Donald Trump warned that the US would take action against the group if the Nigerian government, in his words, continued to allow the targeting of Christians. Abuja rejected those remarks, saying that both Muslims and Christians have been attacked and that it spares no effort to safeguard the religious freedom of all Nigerians. Many say that Trump was pressured by his right-wing Christian base in the US to carry out those attacks in the African country. But are they really aimed at protecting Christians in Nigeria? And what could be the fallout on the country with a highly complex religious makeup? We'll discuss that with our guests in a moment, but first, a report from Amaboteng.
Residents in the town of Jabo assessed damage after a US strike. Nigeria's government confirmed it coordinated with the US in an attack on ISIL camps in the northwestern state of Sokoto. The US Department of War released this video showing a missile launch. President Trump described the operation as numerous perfect strikes and warned there would be more to come. In a post on his social media, he repeated his claim Christians in the country are being targeted, but the Nigerian government says armed groups are attacking both Christian and Muslim civilians. The foreign minister told Al Jazeera he's interested in action and not rhetoric.
It is a very serious matter for us and for our region. It's not about religion. It's not about who said what. It is about getting the results. So we're ready to work with others in fighting terrorism, in fighting insecurity in Nigeria and in our region.
Nigeria has been dealing with violence from armed groups for many years. Boko Haram has a strong presence in the northeast, particularly Borno State. A splinter group, Islamic State West Africa province, that's known to be affiliated with ISIL, also operates in the area. Although the US strikes took place in the northwest, in Sokoto State. The Nigerian government has previously said it's combating a relatively new group in the northwest, known as the Lakurawa, that it says is responsible for several attacks. The military carried out an operation against it earlier this year, saying it was responsible for killing 15 people. For months, evangelical groups in the US, led by Trump ally Senator Ted Cruz, have been claiming Christians in Nigeria are being targeted. The Nigerian government denies this and describes the situation as complex. Armed groups driven by ideology and criminal gangs are also involved in violence and kidnappings, as well as conflict over scarce resources. Many people say all they want is peace and the government to find a lasting solution to the violence. Amaboteng, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Malik Samuel is senior researcher at Good Governance Africa. He joins us from Abuja. Ebenezer Obadare is a senior fellow for Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He joins us from Washington, D.C. David Otto is deputy director of Counterterrorism training at the International Academy for the Fight Against Terrorism. He joins us from Minneapolis. Gentlemen, a warm welcome to you all. Malik, before we actually talk about the strikes, the Christmas Day strikes, let's clear a few things up first. Is there a campaign of Christian genocide in Nigeria, as some conservative lawmakers in the US have claimed? Do the armed groups operating in Nigeria discriminate between Christians and Muslims or anyone of any other faith?
Adrian, thank you for having me. Well, I think this narrative or this talk of Christian genocide in Nigeria has long been disputed since the U.S., especially President Trump, started this campaign. There is nothing like Christian genocide or Christian persecution in Nigeria, but there are people that are targeted, of course, for being Christians, and this is where the Boko Haram faction, the Islamic State West Africa province, comes in, which operates primarily in the northeast. So ISWAP targets communities in southern Borno, where you have large Christian communities. So ISWAP targets these communities specifically because they are Christians. And we also see the same thing in northern Adamawa State, where churches, Christian communities, properties are also destroyed. And this is even evidence in the claims of this attack on different Islamic State-linked social media platforms, where these attacks are celebrated and the victims called crusaders. But that is when you talk about the Boko Haram conflict in the northeast as it relates to the Islamic State West Africa province. But when you talk about the conflict in general in Nigeria, you talk about what is happening in the middle belt or north central of Nigeria, or in the northwest of Nigeria, where these strikes happened. There is clearly nothing of such as the persecution of Christian or the Christian genocide. So it is sad to see what is happening in Nigeria, the complex nature of insecurity in Nigeria being reduced, to a narration of a religion.
All right, let's bring in Ebenezer. As Malik was saying there, it is complex. Is it possible to sum up for us what is actually behind the violence in the north of the country, both in the northeast, where Boko Haram operates, and the northwest, which is where the US struck? If it's not being driven by religion, what is it being driven by? What motivates the armed groups operating in that part of the country?
Thank you for having me. This is where I depart from the mainstream narrative on this question. And my views on this are very clear, and I've expressed them via different kinds of media and in writing. The problem in Nigeria is actually not very complicated. The problem in Nigeria has to do with religion, but not in the way it is generally framed. So here is a way to think about it. It is true that Boko Haram kills indiscriminately. It burns churches as well as mosques. It destroys bridges. It destroys hospitals. It destroys government establishments. It's wild and indiscriminate in its violence, which raises a question. Why? Why kill Muslims and Christians at the same time? Oh, by the way, why kill people who express no religious affiliation whatsoever? The reason is very simple: religion. Boko Haram, and not just Boko Haram, Lakurawa, ISWAP, Al-Shabaab, ISIS, Jenim, Al-Qaeda, and its many affiliates, all of them are united under one sign. They want to abolish the modern state as we have it, and the Nigerian state as an icon of that is very clear in their minds, and they want to substitute it with an Islamist theocracy. The agenda itself is theological, and this is what makes groups like Boko Haram completely different from other groups that perpetrate violence in Nigeria. My colleague is right. There's banditry in Nigeria. There's kidnapping in Nigeria. All of these are downstream effects of the operations of violent Islamists in the northern part of the country. The agenda is broadly, fundamentally essentialist, essentially religious in its origins, and we should not shy away from it. It is true, let me repeat, Christians are being killed. It is true, Muslims are being killed. The question is, why are they being killed? They are being killed for a religious reason. For me, that's the most important part of this.
All right. David, why has Nigeria, the state, failed to get a grip on what's happening in the north of the country? Why is the situation so difficult for the government to resolve?
I think there are several reasons to that. First of all, the main reason has been that the Nigerian authorities have not been able to understand the complexity, by which these groups do operate. And that complexity is to do with the discussions that the previous speakers have, talked about. and which is the religious dimension. What I have to make very clear here from my experience with groups like Boko Haram and ISWAP and the Lukarawas and you can name them, is the fact that when you look at the atrocities, especially when it comes to targets, who are they killing? Is it Christians? Or is it Muslims? Now, you've got to understand, I like the fact that my colleague did mention, why are they killing Christians and Muslims or everyone? It's still down to this religious dimension. The Christians that are being killed are being targeted because they are Christians. The Muslims that are being killed are being targeted majorly because they do not subscribe to the sort of Islamic narrative and dimension that these terrorist groups like Boko Haram and ISWAP, do acclaim to. So they are being killed because they are not supporting the Islamic, version of Boko Haram and ISWAP. So it still boils down to the fact that there is a huge religious dimension to this issue, and it is correct. When some claim that Christians are being targeted, but is there a genocide? As far as the activities of Boko Haram and ISWAP are concerned, I don't think so. I don't think we have gotten to that stage yet. But one can describe it as an overwhelming target against Christians. Now, in terms of why the government, has not been able to deal with this level of insecurity within Nigeria, especially when it comes to counterterrorism, is the fact that one, there has been an overwhelming belief that you can defeat terrorism with more terror. You can bomb out terrorist organizations from far and near, and then you can disseminate them. You can target their leaders, and you can then destroy the group as a result of that. The data has proven that overwhelming force itself, use of airstrikes, use of the military, and this narrative that the army can destroy Boko Haram is one of the main reasons, forgetting to understand that these groups operate for many reasons. So the government has to be able to deal with, the financing of these groups, those who are supporting the groups within the government, stopping these groups from recruiting, from vulnerable population, blocking their narratives, both online and offline, their governance structure, level of discrimination, all that needs to be sorted. And this is where the government is failing, because there's an overwhelming belief that might is right when it comes to defeating terrorism.
Malik, what's been the reaction there in Nigeria to what happened on December 25th? Are people generally supportive of the US attacks, or do they see it as perhaps an infringement on their sovereignty?
No, the reaction has overwhelmingly been positive from Nigerians, and this is understandable because Nigerians want a destruction of these groups because they've caused so much violence. So when Nigerians woke up in the morning of Christmas to hear what has happened, the consensus among Nigerians was this was a good thing. And this is why the Nigerian government also had to come out to say, yes, the strikes happened with its approval. And this is simply because the Nigerian government couldn't have said no, couldn't have said otherwise, couldn't have even said no to the US because it would face backlash. Because Nigerians have unanimously accused the government of not doing enough to protect citizens. If the government did what it was supposed to do, we would not be in this situation. There would be no need for the US to come in and carry out strike. So the reaction, the mood from Nigerians has been unanimous in supporting it. The only difference is the narrative or the narrative by Trump linking the strike in Sokoto to the protection or the need to protect Christians that have been persecuted or that are victims of a Christian genocide. And this is because people who follow the conflict in Nigeria, I just returned from the Northwest just a couple of months ago. I visited these areas, saying there is an Islamic State operational base in the Northwest. That is actually not factual. And I think the group that is being referred to as an ISIS affiliate is the Lakurawa group. And my reason for going to the Northwest was specifically to do some research on this group, and that included interviews with members of this group. Clearly, this group is not linked to ISIS. So it is surprising for a lot of Nigerians, the narrative that Trump has put out, which is clearly contradictory to the reality, of the strike in the region. But in terms of the reaction, the mood of Nigerians is unanimous that this was a good thing, and I think Nigerians also expect more of this strike against the groups, because everybody wants to live in peace, wants to be able to sleep with their two eyes closed.
Okay, Ebenezer, help me understand something here. We've talked a lot so far in our discussion about Boko Haram, but that's not who the US was targeting. As we saw from Amma's report, Boko Haram more active in the northeast of the country, and yet these strikes took place in the northwest of the country and were targeting ISIL, according to the US. And you've all mentioned this group, Lakurawa. Who are they, and what are they about? What are their motives?
So the thing to keep in mind about violent jihadism in northern Nigeria, and this is not just northern Nigeria, by the way. You're talking parts of southern Chad, you're talking about parts of northwest Cameroon, you're talking about the broader Sahel, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. Of course, you all know about what's going on in Somalia, and then throw into that pot what's been going on over the last few years in northern Mozambique. The key point is that it's very difficult to keep track of all these groups. They are all constantly mutating. That's one thing to keep in mind. You have Lakurawa, as my colleagues have mentioned. You have Memuda, you have ISIS, you have Jenim, you have Boko Haram, you have Al-Shabaab, you have ISIL, you have ISWAP. You can't keep track, but you shouldn't. The most important thing is not that there are so many of these groups. The most important thing to keep in mind is this. What is the unifying element? What is it that all of these groups agree on? And that is the point I was making earlier. Right. One can get lost in the weeds of how many of these groups are there, where are they operating, what are the operational dynamics. All of those things are important for research. The core philosophical element.
As far as I'm aware, that Boko Haram, I'll come to you in just a moment, David, but as far as I'm aware, Boko Haram is the biggest of these groups. To what extent did the US target the wrong group in its operation on December 25th? Is it not Boko Haram operating largely in the northeast of the country that poses the biggest threat to people and the country in general?
No. So there is no wrong group to target here. We'll get to Boko Haram in the northeast. But don't forget that the recent attacks in southern Sokoto, in Niger State, in Kwara State, in parts of Benue, in Kogi State, these attacks have according to creditable reports, have emanated from the Sokoto axis. And my guess is that that's why the President Trump has ordered strikes in that region. But also keep in mind, President Trump did not do this in isolation. He did it feeding on intelligence from the Nigerian authorities. So if the Nigerian authorities directed American military strikes in that part of Nigeria, it means that they knew what they were doing and they were aware that there were groups of terrorists massing with an intent to operate in that part of the country.
David, you wanted to come in there.
Yes.
How skeptical should we be about what President Trump says are his reasons for ordering these attacks? To what extent were the wrong people hit and in the wrong place if the motive of the US attacks was to stop violence against Christians?
Well, I think this is quite important. President Trump talked about the fact that Nigeria is a country of particular concern, and therefore, he has to strike against these terrorist groups. But the data that we're having so far in terms of, the local population, this is a location in Sokoto, Jabu, and significantly, Sokoto is home of the caliphate, as they call it, and perhaps this area was targeted for that reason, simply because we haven't had any information neither from the US or nor from the Nigerian authorities nor from the locals within that area that there was any high value target that was hit. The US says it is hit, this Islamic State, but so far we don't know if there were any casualties. Which means that perhaps this could just be a symbolic airstrike by the US to demonstrate to not just the Nigerian authorities, but to the Islamic State ISWAP that it does have the capabilities to carry out airstrikes within that location. So that's one thing. In terms of the narrative that we get from the Nigerians on ground, a lot of people are questioning, first of all, that airstrikes, is something that the Nigerian authorities have been carrying out every day or almost every week, by the Nigerian Air Force. That does not represent, an overwhelming solution to destroy the Islamic State. It's only 1/10 of the solution when it comes to, striking a jihadist target. So that doesn't work. But secondly, the fact that it is the US that reported this attack, this airstrike first before the Nigerian Foreign Ministry, demonstrate that the US then has, authority over the narrative, and this is something that a lot of Nigerians are questioning. So the
David,
impact.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. As Deputy Director of Counterterrorism Training at the International Academy for the Fight Against Terrorism, I must ask you this, and picking up on something you said there about it not working. Do airstrikes like these in Nigeria on December 25th, and the ones we've seen recently in Syria, meaningfully weaken armed groups, or do they entrench, or at least risk entrenching, cycles of violence? Particularly, as you said, we don't know who was killed, who was injured, if civilians have been found to have been killed in this attack.
Yeah, so the danger of using airstrikes, as we've seen, is that it has a couple of, what you call, unintended consequences. The US did use airstrikes against the so-called Islamic State in Raqqa and Mosul. What that did was that, yes, it did weaken the capabilities of the group, the group's intention to set up a caliphate in that region, but it actually displaced the group towards areas like Libya, and then, of course, towards Africa, where we're seeing a lot of these groups re-emerging. So what we've seen as a result of, overwhelmingly using airstrikes, by the military is the fact that, one, it displaces these groups, from one location to another, but it doesn't actually end their operations, because terrorists are not afraid to die. They have different motivations. They're well radicalized. So on one hand, you can demonstrate that, yes, you have the capabilities. But what we've seen as a result of our experience in the field is that airstrikes, targeting terrorist groups, with using overwhelming strength, does not necessarily resolve the problem. Sometimes it does have a ripple effect, of having civilian populations being targeted. Yes, there is an acceptable casualty level that each country does have, but when you do target, use airstrikes, and you describe them as precision airstrikes, it's not necessarily the case as it may have other ripple effects.
Malik, to what extent do these Christmas Day strikes on Nigeria risk making the situation worse? I mean, what could be the potential spillover into the wider region?
First, I think we need to understand that, rightly, like David mentioned, before this strike, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, even 3 weeks ago, the Nigerian military carried out successful strikes in that region against Lakurawa. I'm sure people remember the last mass abductions, the last 2 mass abductions that happened. As a result of those abductions, there were serious airstrikes in this area by the Nigerian military, aided by intelligence from the US. And the airstrikes by Nigeria was successful by killing lots of the fighters, especially from Lakurawa, including the leader of Lakurawa in Nigeria, who lost his first son in an attack that happened just last week. Now, to think about the possible impact of such airstrike, in the region, like David rightly mentioned, of course, these fighters would want to flee from their enclaves, knowing that there's information about their presence to authorities. So the likelihood is they will leave these places and go to other places where they can entrench or even embed themselves in these places. And the risk is the possible casualty figures of civilians. We saw, I think, in Offa in Kwara State and in Jabo, where some munitions were found, and I think the report we were getting was that those were not the target; those were mistakes. So, what would have happened if these munitions had fallen on civilian populations? You risk radicalizing even the civilians in these areas that you claim to want to protect. So, these are the dangers of relying heavily on airstrikes.
Ebenezer, we're rapidly running out of time. We've got about 2 minutes here. Tell us something about the timing of the attacks and whether or not they were designed to placate a domestic US audience. Can military action alone address the drivers of violence across the north? Is this anything other than a short-term fix, if indeed it's a fix at all? And what does it say about President Tinubu's leadership? Was he forced to go along with this, or is it decisive leadership on his part?
I think both the United States government and the Tinubu government in Nigeria came under pressure. The United States government from pro-Christian advocacy groups and similar groups in the United States, the Nigerian government from the United States government that was coming under domestic pressure itself. So both, in a sense, were reacting to different kinds of pressure. Would this work? It depends on how you think about what will work. In the short term, when you're dealing with extreme violence, you have to bring extreme violence to it. There's no other way to it. Boko Haram has killed anything between 50,000 people and 500,000 people over the last 16 years, depending on any the source you're looking at. So there is no doubt that you have to bring pressure to the group in the short term. In the long term, you have to invest in the work of ideological deprogramming, because you're dealing at the end of the day with a body of ideas that are very poisonous, and the long-term investment have to be made in removing those ideas from the part of society where they're deeply embedded.
Okay, there, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it. Many thanks indeed to you all, gentlemen. Malik Samuel, Ebenezer Obadare, and David Otto. Thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can always join the conversation on X, our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. Bye for now.